Welcome to Family Shadows, a place where stories about love, sacrifice, and the hidden struggles within families come to life. If you've ever felt the weight of unspoken words between loved ones, you're in the right place. Take a moment to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next story that might just touch your heart or change the way you see your own family. Today's story: my son told me to stay out of his life, so I sold the business he was meant to inherit. I remember the way his fork scraped against the plate. That metallic sound still rings in my ears, not because it was loud, but because it came just seconds before the words that would break something inside me. It was a Friday evening in late September, the kind where the daylight hangs around a little longer than it should, clinging to the edges of the sky like it doesn't want to leave summer behind. We were sitting at the oak dining table that had been in our family for over 40 years. Maggie, my wife, had picked it out when Ethan was still a toddler. She said she wanted a table that could take a beating, something that would survive spilled milk, homework scratches, and the occasional slammed fist during teenage arguments. It had survived all of that and more. Until that night. Ethan was 32 now, old enough to have built something of his own, I thought. Old enough to understand that family and the sacrifices behind it were worth more than pride. But as I watched him push his chicken around the plate without eating, I could tell this wasn't going to be one of our casual father-son dinners. There was a heaviness in the air, the kind that comes before a thunderstorm. "Dad," he began, his eyes fixed on the table. "I need to say something, and I don't want you to interrupt." I set my fork down slowly. My instincts told me to brace for impact, but a part of me still hoped he was about to say something like, "I'm moving closer," or "I've met someone I want you to meet." "I think," he continued, "it's best if you stay out of my life." The words didn't land all at once. They trickled in like ice water down the back of my neck. Stay out of his life. I must have looked like I hadn't heard him correctly because he went on, his voice steady but cold. "You've been controlling everything for as long as I can remember. The business, my career, even the way I live. I'm 32 years old, Dad, and I can't breathe under your shadow anymore." There's a moment in every father's life when the years of hard work, the sacrifices, the late nights, all the things you told yourself you were doing for them are called into question. That moment had arrived for me, and it was sitting across the table wearing my son's face. I thought of Maggie. If she were here, she'd put her hand over mine under the table, giving me that silent look that said, "Don't lose your temper." But she'd been gone for 11 years, and the only thing under the table now was my own clenched fist. "Ethan," I said slowly, "everything I've done was to give you. Exactly, to give me. You never asked if I wanted it." He looked up now, and there was no anger in his eyes. That would have been easier to take. This was worse. This was conviction. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The clock in the hallway ticked like it was counting down to something inevitable. I swallowed, trying to find the right words, but he beat me to it. "I'm not your project, Dad. I'm your son. And if you can't let me live my life the way I want, then we shouldn't be in each other's lives at all." It was like he'd just drawn a line in permanent ink, one I couldn't erase. I drove home that night with the windows down, letting the cool air hit my face. I told myself it would pass, that he was just frustrated, that maybe something at work had gone wrong. But deep down, I knew this wasn't heat-of-the-moment anger. This was a decision. When Maggie died, Ethan and I clung to each other like survivors on a lifeboat. I cooked him breakfast every morning, even when I had board meetings at 8. I went to every game, every recital, every milestone. And when he was old enough, I brought him into Turner & Co., the company I'd built from nothing but a loan, a pickup truck, and a stubborn belief that hard work could beat luck. Maybe that was my mistake. I didn't just give him a job. I gave him a destiny, one he never asked for. That night, I walked through the empty halls of the house. Every room was a museum of our family's history, framed photographs of vacations, Ethan's first day at school, Maggie's smile in the kitchen light. I stopped in front of the study, where the shelves were lined with leather-bound ledgers from the company's early days, On the desk sat a picture of the three of us on the day we cut the ribbon for the new headquarters. Ethan was just 23 then, wearing a suit a size too big but grinning like he owned the world. I stood there for a long time, staring at that photo, trying to reconcile the young man in it with the one who had just told me to disappear. The next morning, I went to the office early. The city was just waking up, and the smell of coffee and asphalt filled the air. Turner & Co.'s glass building reflected the sunrise like a promise. Inside, my assistant greeted me with the same warmth she always had, but I barely heard her. I closed my office door and sat behind the desk that had been mine for 35 years. I ran my hand over the wood, feeling the grooves and scratches, the evidence of a lifetime. It struck me then how much of my identity was tied to this place. Without it, who was I? Rachel Cole, my CFO, knocked and stepped inside. "Morning, Jack, you all right? You look like you've been up all night." I gave her a tired smile. "Just thinking about legacies." She raised an eyebrow. "The kind you leave or the kind people expect?" I didn't answer. That evening I sat at the kitchen table again, this time alone. The chair across from me was empty, but I could still see Ethan there, hear his voice saying those words. My appetite was gone. I poured myself a glass of bourbon and stared at the condensation running down the side. In the quiet, I could almost hear Maggie's voice. "Jack, you can't hold on to him forever. Sooner or later, you have to let him find his own way." But letting go, I didn't know how to do that. And that's when an idea began to form. An idea I didn't fully understand yet, but one that would change everything. I didn't know then that it would lead to a boardroom full of stunned faces, a deal with an old rival, and a decision that would rewrite the meaning of inheritance in our family forever. But I knew one thing: if Ethan wanted me out of his life, I was going to give him exactly what he asked for. I didn't always have this distance with Ethan. There was a time when I knew every corner of his world, what music he was into, which friends he couldn't stand, the name of the girl he secretly liked but wouldn't admit to. That was before life took Maggie from us. She was 39, too young for the word widow to make any sense in my mouth. Cancer didn't care. It came like a thief in the night, quiet at first, then relentless. For 8 months our home became a war zone of pill bottles, whispered doctors' instructions, and nights where neither of us slept. Ethan was 21 then, old enough to understand but too young to carry the weight. I watched him shrink into himself during those months, the easy smile gone, replaced with a quiet that made me ache. When she passed, we didn't cry in each other's arms like in the movies. We sat in the hospital parking lot in silence, the world moving around us as if nothing had happened. I drove us home, and that was the first night I noticed the house was too big for 2 people. I threw myself into the business. It was all I knew how to do. The company was like a dam against the flood of grief. If I kept busy enough, maybe I wouldn't drown. But in doing that, I left Ethan adrift. It wasn't intentional. I thought I was helping him. I'd tell him to focus on your future, when what he probably needed was, let's just sit together and hurt for a while. But grief has a way of making you think you're the only one carrying the heavy load. I thought he was stronger than he was. A few months after the funeral, I asked him to come work at Turner & Co. It was meant as an offer, but it came out sounding like a command. He said yes, probably because it was easier than arguing. I put him in an office next to mine, gave him projects, and started grooming him to be the man who'd one day take over. At first, he played along. I told myself he was learning. I'd watch him in meetings, sitting straight-backed in those tailored suits, nodding at the right moments. But I missed the way his eyes wandered toward the window, the way he exhaled through his nose when I interrupted him to add some perspective. I didn't notice the way he stiffened every time someone called him Jack's boy instead of Ethan Turner. The first cracks showed a couple of years in. He'd skip a morning meeting without calling. He started coming in late, blaming traffic or needing to clear his head. I'd find him in his office scrolling through real estate listings for loft apartments in another city. When I asked why, he'd shrug it off. The truth hit me one night after an awards gala for the company. I'd just been honored for 30 years in business, and I stood on stage, thanking the employees who had helped build our success. I ended my speech by saying, "And one day I'll be proud to hand the keys to my son, who I know will take Turner & Co. to even greater heights." The applause was thunderous, but when I looked at Ethan sitting at our table, he wasn't smiling. He was staring at the linen tablecloth, his jaw tight. That night, he didn't ride back with me. I watched from the hotel lobby as he left with a group of friends, laughing in that too loud way people do when they're trying to prove they're fine. The distance grew after that. We'd go weeks without speaking about anything that wasn't work-related. When we did talk, it felt like we were both following a script we didn't believe in anymore. I'd give him advice, and he'd give me the kind of nod that said he'd already decided not to follow it. I tried to fix it by pushing harder, more responsibility, bigger projects, more public praise. I thought if I just kept showing him I believed in him, he'd rise to it. But all it did was make the air between us heavier. The moment that sealed it came on his 29th birthday. I'd arranged for the board to meet him privately, to start discussing the official transition plan for him to take over within 5 years. I thought it was the ultimate gift. Halfway through the meeting, he stood up. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I'm not sure I want this." Silence, then nervous laughter like people thought he was joking, but he wasn't. He walked out before the meeting ended, leaving me alone at the head of the table with every eye on me. That night I called him. He didn't pick up. Instead, I got a text hours later, "We'll talk later. Please, Dad, I just need space." I didn't understand then that space was just the polite word for distance you don't plan to close. Looking back now, I think I lost pieces of him in stages. First to grief, then to the weight of my expectations, and finally to his own need for freedom. I told myself I was shaping him into a leader. Maybe what I was really doing was chiseling away at the person he was trying to become. And that's why, when he sat across from me at that dining table years later, telling me to stay out of his life, it wasn't a sudden storm. It was the final crack in a wall that had been crumbling for years. I didn't know it yet, but the choice I was about to make, the one that would shock him, hurt him, maybe even free him, had been building inside me for a long, long time. The Monday after that dinner, I sat in my office staring at the skyline like it was a puzzle I couldn't solve. The city looked alive, cranes swinging over half-finished buildings, streams of traffic crawling through morning light. But inside me, something felt stuck. I kept replaying Ethan's words in my head. Not just the stay out of my life part, but the way he'd said it, calm, final, like a man delivering a verdict he'd been deliberating on for years. Rachel came in with the weekly performance report. "Profits are up 6% this quarter," she said, laying the folder on my desk. "Not bad for a company that's been around since before most of our competitors were even born." I nodded but didn't open the folder. Numbers didn't matter to me that morning. She hesitated before speaking again. "Jack, you've built something extraordinary here, but I've been noticing things are shifting. Departments are siloed, morale's shaky in a few divisions," and she stopped herself. "And Ethan," I finished for her. Rachel's face softened. She'd known him since he was a teenager, when he used to hang around the office in his baseball uniform, waiting for me to finish work so I could take him to practice. "He's smart, Jack," she said, "but he's restless, and if you two keep locking horns, one of you is going to walk away." I leaned back in my chair. "Feels like he already has." The cracks Rachel mentioned were real, and they weren't just in my relationship with Ethan. The company itself, my life's work, was showing signs of strain. It started with small things, a missed deadline on a key project, a marketing campaign that fell flat, a department head resigning unexpectedly. Normally, I would have addressed these issues with Ethan at my side. But lately, he'd been avoiding the boardroom, sending in written updates instead of showing up in person. Clients noticed. Investors noticed. And I noticed most of all. At the next quarterly review, I watched him walk into the room 5 minutes late, dressed sharp but with that distracted air that told me his mind was elsewhere. He gave his presentation in a clipped, efficient tone, hitting all the numbers but none of the heart. When it was over, I asked, "Ethan, where do you see Turner & Co. in 5 years?" He paused just long enough for the silence to feel awkward. "I guess, expanding into other markets, digital maybe, diversifying." It was a safe answer, too safe. It told me he hadn't been dreaming about this place the way I had all my life. And maybe that was the point, maybe he didn't want to dream about it at all. Later that week, I stopped by his office. He was on the phone, his back to me, talking in a low voice. When he hung up, he looked startled to see me standing there. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Yeah, just personal stuff." He shuffled some papers on his desk like he needed to create distance. I sat down across from him. "You've been quiet lately. If something's wrong, I want to know." He sighed. "Dad, not everything's about the company, not everything's about you." The words landed like a slap. I opened my mouth, then closed it. There it was again, that wall between us, built brick by brick over the years, now so high I could barely see him on the other side. I found myself staying later at the office, long after most people had gone home. I'd walk the empty halls, hearing the echo of my footsteps, remembering when Maggie would bring Ethan here on Friday nights with a pizza, and we'd eat in the break room while I finished up. Back then, the company was a second home. Now, it felt like a place where ghosts lingered. One night, while sorting through old files in the archive room, I came across a box labeled Ethan Training. Inside were notes from when he first started, performance reviews, leadership assessments, even the outlines I'd made for projects I thought would challenge him. I flipped through them, and a pattern emerged. Every time he'd shown initiative in a direction I hadn't planned, I'd redirected him back toward my vision. I told myself it was guidance, but on paper, it looked a lot like control. That realization sat heavy in my chest. The following weekend, I drove to the lake house, the one Maggie and I had bought as a quiet escape, the one Ethan used to love when he was a boy. I thought maybe being there would clear my head. The air smelled of pine and old wood. Inside, the furniture was exactly as we'd left it last summer, dust motes floating in the sunlight through the big bay window. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring at the still water. It struck me then. The company wasn't the only thing showing cracks. I was. And if something didn't change soon, those cracks would split wide open, swallowing not just Turner & Co., but whatever fragile thread still connected me to my son. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I could feel a decision forming, one that would shake the foundation of everything I'd built. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure whether I was building something new or preparing to let it all go. The decision to ask Ethan out to lunch came to me on a Thursday morning, somewhere between my second cup of coffee and the moment I realized I hadn't spoken to him outside of business hours in nearly a month. It wasn't that I thought lunch could fix everything, but there was a stubborn part of me, maybe the same part that had kept Turner & Co. alive through 3 recessions, that refused to believe we were beyond repair. I called him just after 9. "Hey, you free for lunch today?" I asked, keeping my tone light. There was a pause on the other end. "I guess so. Where?" I suggested Marino's, the little Italian place we used to go to when he was a kid. Back then it was our spot, red checkered tablecloths, garlic knots that came out steaming, the kind of place where the waiter didn't just know your name but remembered how you liked your pasta cooked. He hesitated. "All right, noon." "Noon," I said, hanging onto that small victory like it meant something. When I arrived, Marino's was just as I remembered it, the smell of fresh basil hitting me before I even opened the door, the faint hum of Sinatra playing over the speakers. The owner, Tony, greeted me with a smile that deepened the creases around his eyes. "Jack Turner, haven't seen you in a while. You bringing the boy?" I nodded. "He's on his way." Tony's grin faltered for a split second. Maybe he'd heard things. Maybe he just sensed the weight I was carrying, but he quickly recovered and led me to a booth near the window. I ordered a club soda and waited, watching the street outside. At 12:07, Ethan walked in. Sharp suit, no tie, sunglasses pushed up into his hair. He looked every inch the successful young executive, but there was a stiffness in his posture that wasn't there when he was younger. "Hey, Dad," he said, sliding into the booth. We made small talk at first, the weather, a new restaurant opening near his apartment, the kind of conversation that fills space without actually touching it. The waiter came, we ordered, and then the silence settled in. I decided to cut straight to it. "Ethan, I feel like we've been off track for a while." He looked down at his hands, fiddling with the edge of his napkin. "Yeah, I guess we have." "I'm not here to lecture," I said. "I just want to understand. Somewhere along the line I must have pushed too hard. Maybe I was trying to turn you into something you didn't want to be." His eyes flicked up to mine, cautious. "Dad, it's not just that. It's I don't know who I am outside of your shadow. Every move I make, people say it's because you set it up for me. Even when I succeed, it's like they think it's your success, not mine." That hit me harder than I expected, because deep down I knew he was right. "I thought giving you the company would be giving you a gift," I said quietly. "Turns out maybe I was giving you a chain." He didn't answer right away. The waiter brought our food, plates clinking against the table. For a moment, we both busied ourselves with fork and knife, as if the act of eating could shield us from the truth hanging in the air. Finally, he said, "I don't want to hurt you, Dad, but I can't live my life the way you want me to just because it's what you worked for." I nodded, swallowing a piece of chicken that felt suddenly hard to get down. "I understand, but the truth was I didn't, not fully, or maybe I didn't want to." The rest of the lunch was polite but hollow. We talked about a project he was working on, not for Turner & Co., but something he was consulting on for a friend's startup. I noticed how his eyes lit up when he spoke about it, how his voice carried a kind of excitement I hadn't heard in years. And that excitement, it wasn't for anything connected to me. When the check came, I reached for it out of habit, but he stopped me. "I've got it." It was such a small thing, but it felt symbolic. We walked out onto the sidewalk. The autumn air had a crisp edge to it, the kind that hinted winter wasn't far off. For a moment, we stood there, the hum of traffic filling the space between us. "Thanks for lunch," he said, and then he was gone, melting into the stream of people heading down the street. I watched him go, my hand resting on the back of the bench outside Marino's. It occurred to me then that we just had what people call a nice lunch, and yet I felt more distance from him than before we sat down. Driving back to the office, I passed the river. The sunlight hit the water just right, making it look almost gold. It should have been beautiful, but all I could think about was how, no matter how calm the surface looked, the current underneath was always moving, always pulling. That was the last lunch we had together before everything changed. The Monday after that lunch, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. I'd been telling myself that the conversation with Ethan wasn't the end of anything, that maybe we'd reached a quiet understanding, even if it wasn't the one I'd hoped for. The building was still half asleep when I walked in. The cleaning crew was finishing up in the lobby, the faint scent of lemon polish hanging in the air. The hum of the elevators was the only sound. When I reached the executive floor, the corridor was dark except for the low light spilling out from my own office. I passed Rachel's door, closed as usual this early. Then I reached Ethan's. It was wide open. At first, I thought nothing of it, maybe he'd stepped out to grab coffee. But as I crossed the threshold, the silence hit me. The desk, normally cluttered with reports and a coffee mug or two, was bare. The shelves behind it were empty, the framed photos gone. The only thing left was a single envelope in the center of the desk with my name on it. I picked it up, the weight of it telling me it held just one sheet of paper. "Dad," it began, "I've decided to step away from Turner & Co. I need to figure out who I am without the company, without you guiding every move. This isn't about anger, it's about finding my own path. I hope someday you'll understand." There was no signature, just his name typed at the bottom like it was a business memo. I stood there for a long time, holding that letter, the hum of the building around me sounding suddenly distant. My mind went back to the morning Maggie, and I dropped him off for his first day of kindergarten, the way he'd clung to her hand, then finally let go, walking toward the door with his little backpack bouncing against his shoulders. Back then, letting go had been the hardest thing I'd ever done. I hadn't realized I'd have to do it again and that it would feel 1,000 times worse. Rachel found me like that a few minutes later. She took one look at the empty shelves and the letter in my hand, and her face softened. "He's gone," she asked quietly. I nodded. "Did you know?" She shook her head. I knew he'd been restless, but no, not this. She stepped into the office, glancing around. Jack, maybe this is his way of making space for himself. Sometimes space is the only way people figure out what they really want. I didn't answer. My eyes were fixed on the view out the window, the skyline stretching toward the horizon, the city moving on like nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I sat through meetings where voices sounded far away, where charts and projections meant nothing. My mind kept drifting back to Ethan's desk, stripped of every trace of him, like he'd never been there at all. In the afternoon, I wandered into the archive room again. I pulled out a random file, not because I needed it, but because the weight of my own office felt unbearable. The file turned out to be from 25 years ago, a client we'd landed after months of chasing. I remembered celebrating that night with Maggie, taking Ethan out for ice cream even though it was past his bedtime. That's what the company had always been to me. Not just deals and profit margins, but a life woven together with family. Now it felt like one half of that fabric had been torn away. When I finally left for the day, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the glass atrium. I paused in the lobby, looking back at the building as the lights flickered on floor by floor. For the first time, I wondered what Turner & Co. would look like without a Turner in it. And the thought didn't just unsettle me, it lodged itself in my chest like a question I couldn't ignore. I didn't know it yet, but that question was the first step toward the decision that would turn my son's world and mine upside down. The first week without Ethan at Turner & Co. felt like someone had removed a piece of furniture from a familiar room. The absence was subtle but impossible to ignore. I'd walk past his office out of habit, half expecting to hear the low murmur of his voice on a call, the rhythmic tapping of his keyboard. Instead, there was only the hollow quiet of a space that no longer belonged to anyone. In my own office, the silence felt heavier than usual. For decades, that room had been my command post, a place where decisions were made, deals were struck, and the pulse of the company seemed to beat right through the mahogany desk. Now, the walls felt closer somehow, the air a little stiller, like the room was waiting for me to admit something I wasn't ready to say. I still arrived early every morning, but not with the same energy. My routine had once been built around motion, calls to make, fires to put out, plans to review with Ethan. Without him, I moved through the day slower, lingering over my coffee, staring out the window longer, finding reasons to avoid the constant hum of the office floor below. One afternoon, Rachel knocked on my door. She carried a stack of quarterly reports but set them aside without opening them. "You've been quiet lately," she said. Sitting down across from me, I gave a small shrug. "Just thinking about the business." "About everything," I said. "The business, Ethan. What all of this means now." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "Jack, you've been carrying Turner & Co. on your back for over 3 decades. Maybe it's time to ask yourself what you want your life to look like if you weren't doing this every day." Her words hung in the air. It wasn't the first time someone had suggested I slow down. Maggie had tried more than once, but it was the first time the idea didn't feel absurd. "Without this place," I said quietly, "I'm not sure I'd know who I am." Rachel's expression softened. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe it's time to find out." That night I stayed long after the last light on the office floor had gone dark. I walked the corridors, listening to the faint hum of the HVAC system and the creak of the elevator cables. The building was mine in those hours. No ringing phones, no voices, no constant demands. Just me and the echo of my own footsteps. I ended up in the lobby, standing before the glass wall that looked out onto the city. From here, I could see the streetlights stretching into the distance, the traffic moving like a steady current, unstoppable and indifferent. I thought about how Turner & Co. had become my anchor after Maggie died, how I'd poured all my grief and energy into keeping it afloat, believing that if I could just hand it over to Ethan one day, I'd have fulfilled my purpose. Now that purpose was gone, or maybe it had never been his to begin with. The next morning, I stopped by the small cafe across the street before heading up to my office. The young barista behind the counter greeted me with the kind of casual friendliness that comes from seeing someone every day. "Your usual, Mr. Turner." "Sure," I said, then found myself staring at the chalkboard menu above her head. It listed seasonal drinks, muffins, even a pay-it-forward board where people could buy coffee for strangers. I realized this place had probably only been open a couple of years, and yet it had already built a community, regulars, conversations, warmth. That's when it hit me. A business didn't have to last forever to matter. Turner & Co. had been my life's work, yes, but maybe its chapter in my story and in Ethan's was coming to a natural close. Later that week, Rachel came by again. This time she didn't have any reports. She just closed the door and said, "Jack, if you ever decided to sell, there are people who'd be interested. Serious people. You've got leverage, the market's strong right now, and you'd have the freedom to do whatever you wanted next." I didn't answer right away. I stared at the photo on my desk, me, Maggie, and a young Ethan cutting the ribbon at the new headquarters, all three of us smiling like the future was certain. The truth was, I wasn't afraid of selling. I was afraid of what it would mean to Ethan, afraid it would feel like a betrayal. But then I thought about his letter. I need to figure out who I am without the company, without you guiding every move. Maybe letting go wasn't betrayal. Maybe it was the only way to give him the freedom he claimed to want. And maybe, just maybe, it would give me mine, too. The call came on a Wednesday morning. I was halfway through answering emails when my assistant's voice came over the intercom. "Jack, there's a Victor Hale on line 2, says it's important." For a moment, I just stared at the phone. Victor Hale. I hadn't heard that name in years, but it was one you didn't forget. He was the kind of competitor who didn't just want to beat you in business. He wanted to take the trophy home and hang it on his wall. We'd crossed paths more times than I cared to count, bidding for the same contracts, chasing the same clients. Sometimes I won, sometimes he did, but it was never without leaving a mark. I picked up the phone. "Victor, Jack Turner," he said, his voice still carrying that smooth confidence that made people underestimate him. "It's been a while." "It has," I said cautiously. "What can I do for you?" "Well, I could dance around it, but I think you'd appreciate me getting straight to the point. I hear Turner & Co. is at a crossroads." I felt my jaw tighten. "And where did you hear that?" He chuckled. "Jack, you and I both know this industry talks. Word is your son stepped away. And when an heir apparent walks out, it usually means something's in motion." I didn't confirm or deny it. "What's your point, Victor?" "My point is," he said, "I'm interested. If you've ever thought about selling, I'm ready to make an offer. And not just any offer, one that will put more zeros in your bank account than you've ever seen in one place." I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the city skyline. Selling had been a vague idea until now, something Rachel had mentioned, something I'd turned over in my mind in the quiet hours. But hearing Victor say it out loud, hearing the certainty in his voice made it feel real. "You want Turner & Co." I said slowly. "I've wanted Turner & Co. for a long time," he replied. "You built something remarkable, but even remarkable things need the right steward at the right time. I could take what you've made and push it further. You could walk away knowing it's in capable hands." I almost laughed at the irony. The man who'd spent 30 years trying to outmaneuver me was now pitching himself as the company's savior. "And what about my employees?" I asked. "They'd be taken care of," he said quickly. Then after a pause, "Though full transparency, I'd want my own leadership team in place, which means your son wouldn't be part of the picture." There it was, the quiet condition buried in the fine print. I didn't respond right away. Victor seemed to take my silence as an opening. "Jack, think about it. You've done your time in the trenches. You could be anywhere you want, the coast, the mountains, Europe, while I make sure Turner & Co. doesn't just survive but thrives." It wasn't the pitch that stayed with me. It was that line about Ethan. No matter how distant things had grown between us, Turner and Co. had always been the thread that connected us, even when it was frayed. If I sold to Victor, that thread would snap completely, and maybe that was the point. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice even. "I'll send over a preliminary proposal," Victor replied smoothly. "No rush, but let's just say timing is everything." When I hung up, the office felt smaller, like the air had thickened. I stared at the phone for a long time, Victor's words replaying in my head. Your son wouldn't be part of the picture. It was almost too perfect, the clean break Ethan had asked for, delivered in a way that would make sure there was no going back. And for the first time since that night at the dining table, I began to imagine a future where Turner and Co. no longer belonged to me or to him. That night, I didn't turn on the lights when I came home. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the floorboards as they adjusted to the cool air outside. I poured myself a bourbon and sat in the living room, the amber liquid catching the dim glow from the street lamp outside. I didn't bother with music or the television. I just sat there, letting the weight of Victor's offer settle over me like a heavy coat. Selling Turner and Co. to Victor Hale, it was the kind of decision that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. Back then, the company wasn't just a livelihood, it was my lifeline. It had carried me through Maggie's illness, through the long nights of raising Ethan alone, through every high and low that had defined my adult life. But now the company felt less like a lifeline and more like an anchor, pulling me towards something I wasn't sure I wanted to hold onto anymore. I found myself walking into my study, the one room in the house that hadn't changed since Maggie passed. Her books still lined the shelves, her handwriting still marked the edges of old recipe cards in the desk drawer. In the corner sat the armchair she used to read in, a faded quilt draped over the back. I sat down, the quilt smelling faintly of lavender even after all these years, and for the first time in a long while I spoke to her, not out loud but in that quiet place in my mind where I still believed she could hear me. "Maggie, what would you do? Would you tell me to fight for this company like I always have? Or would you tell me to let it go, to let Ethan go before the damage between us is permanent?" Her answer didn't come in words. It came in memory. I was back in the hospital room, years ago, sitting beside her bed. She'd been so tired then, her voice just a whisper, but her eyes, they still held that steady calm that had kept me grounded for 25 years. She'd reached for my hand, her skin warm despite the Roman IV line running into her arm. "Jack," she'd said, "one day you're going to have to let him make his own mistakes. You can't build his life for him and expect him to live in it happily. It has to be his." I'd nodded, promising her I would. But promises made in the shadow of grief have a way of getting lost once you're back in the light. I'd gone right back to building, right back to steering him toward what I thought was safe. And here we were. The bourbon was half gone when I made my way upstairs. I didn't sleep much, just lay there in the dark, the ceiling fan spinning above me, my mind running the numbers, the logistics, the fallout. Every road seemed to lead to the same place. Ethan and I were never going to find common ground if Turner and Co. remained between us. By 3 in the morning, I'd made up my mind. I would sell, not because Victor's offer was generous, though it was, not because I was tired, though I was, but because I finally understood that the company wasn't the inheritance Ethan needed. He needed the chance to build something of his own. And maybe if I let go now, there was still a chance he'd come back to me, not as my successor, but as my son. The next day, I called Rachel into my office. "I've decided," I told her. "We're going to sell to Victor Hale." Her eyebrows rose, but she didn't look surprised. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," I said. "Draw up the paperwork, keep it quiet for now. I'll announce it at the next board meeting." Rachel hesitated before standing. "Jack, you know what this will mean for Ethan." I nodded. "I do." What I didn't tell her was that his reaction was part of the point. He'd drawn a line, told me to stay out of his life. This would make sure I stayed on my side of it for good. As Rachel left the room, I turned back to the window. The city stretched out in front of me, busy and indifferent as if it didn't care what I was about to do. But somewhere out there, my son was living a life without me in it, and soon I'd make sure there was nothing left tying him to the one I'd built. The decision had been made, but I knew the real test would be in the telling. A sale of Turner & Co. wasn't just a financial transaction, it was a change of bloodline. For 35 years, this company had carried my name, my reputation, my fingerprints on every decision. Announcing it would be like cutting the ribbon on a coffin. The board met once a quarter, but I wasn't going to wait that long. I asked Rachel to schedule an urgent meeting for the following Thursday. Every board member, every senior executive, no exceptions, and make sure Ethan gets an invitation. I told her formal, just like the others. She gave me a searching look but didn't argue. The week leading up to the meeting felt like standing on train tracks, hearing the faint hum of something massive barreling toward me. I spent those days moving through the office like a ghost, making mental notes of things I'd once overlooked. The way the receptionist greeted everyone by name, the smell of fresh paper from the copy room, the faded team photo in the break room from our first year in business. At night, I sat in my kitchen with a glass of bourbon, going over the words in my head. How do you tell a room full of people that the thing they've built their careers on will soon belong to someone else? How do you look your son in the eye and tell him the last bridge between you is about to be burned? Thursday arrived. I woke before dawn, showered, shaved, and put on the navy suit I reserved for big moments. Not weddings or funerals, moments where decisions shaped futures. I told myself this was one of those moments. By the time I reached the office, the boardroom was already being prepped, carafes of coffee, platters of pastries, stacks of agenda packets that were little more than window dressing. The real agenda would be mine alone. I stood at the head of the long table, resting my hands on the polished wood. The surface was cold under my palms, as if reminding me that nothing about this would be warm. One by one they filed in. Faces I'd known for decades, faces that had been with me through recessions, expansions, and more than a few late-night strategy sessions. There was chatter at first, speculation about why I'd called them in. Then the room began to quiet. And then Ethan walked in. He looked composed, even casual, in a gray suit with an open-collared shirt. He glanced at me briefly before taking a seat midway down the table. Not too close, not too far. Our eyes didn't meet again. Rachel passed out the last of the packets, then sat down near the end of the table. "All right," she said. "I think we're all here." I cleared my throat. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I'll get right to it. Turner & Co. has been my life's work. Many of you have been with me for most of that journey, and you know as well as I do that times change, markets shift, and leadership must adapt." I let the words settle, scanning the room. No one moved. "I've made a decision," I continued. "After careful consideration, I've agreed to sell Turner & Co. to a party I believe is positioned to take the company into its next chapter." A ripple went through the room, a mix of surprise and disbelief. Ethan's head snapped toward me, his expression unreadable. "I'll be introducing the buyer at a later date," I said, keeping my voice steady, "but I can tell you now that this decision wasn't made lightly. It's about the future of the company, its stability, and ensuring it can thrive long after I step away." Someone down the table asked, "What about family succession? Wasn't that always the plan?" I looked directly at Ethan. "Plans change." For a moment, the room was utterly still. Then the low buzz of side conversations began, chairs shifting, questions rising all at once. But I didn't hear them. My focus was locked on my son, who sat frozen, eyes fixed on me like he was trying to decide whether I'd just saved him or betrayed him completely. The meeting moved on to routine matters, but no one was paying attention. They were already thinking about what this meant for them, for their jobs, for the company they'd tied their names to. When it adjourned, people left in clusters, murmuring as they filed out. Ethan stayed seated for a moment, then rose slowly. "Dad," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." "We will," I replied, but I didn't promise when. He stood there another second, searching my face for something I wasn't ready to give, then walked out without looking back. The boardroom was empty again, the chairs pushed in neatly, the coffee growing cold. I stood at the head of the table, hands in my pockets, staring at the door Ethan had just walked through. The fuse was lit. The formal announcement was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Long enough for the lawyers to finalize the contract, long enough for the ink on the non-disclosure agreements to dry, long enough for me to second-guess the hell out of what I was about to do. But I didn't. If anything, the quiet days between the board meeting and the reveal only made me more certain. I could feel the change in the air at Turner & Co. The hum of speculation in the hallways, the sidelong glances when I walked past, the way conversations trailed off the moment I stepped into the break room. Word had traveled faster than any memo. Ethan kept his distance. I'd see him in the elevator lobby or passing in the corridor, and we'd exchange the kind of polite nod reserved for strangers who happened to share the same building. It was a strange thing, how absence could take root in the middle of proximity. When the day finally came, the boardroom felt different from the last meeting. Tighter, more charged, as though the walls themselves were leaning in to hear what I was about to say. The executives sat in a tense half-circle, their coffees untouched. Rachel was near the end of the table, her eyes steady on me. Ethan was there too, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, a posture I recognized from his teenage years. The one he used when he was preparing for a fight he thought he'd win. I stood at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming. I told you last time that Turner & Co. would soon have new leadership. Today, I'm here to tell you who that will be." I let the silence stretch just long enough for anticipation to settle in every corner of the room. "The buyer," I said finally, "is Hale Industries." It was like a gust of wind had ripped through the room. Murmurs erupted instantly, chairs shifted, people exchanged looks that weren't even trying to hide their shock. Ethan straightened in his seat. "Hale Industries, Victor Hale." "Yes," I said, my voice even. "Victor and I have reached an agreement that will transfer full ownership of Turner & Co. to him and his leadership team effective next quarter." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "You've spent my whole life telling me that man would gut this place if he ever got his hands on it, and now you're just—" I held up a hand. "I know what I've said about Victor, but I also know when a chapter is over. This is what's best for the company moving forward." I could feel the heat coming off him from across the table. "And what about me?" he asked. I didn't blink. "The agreement includes conditions. One of them is that the new ownership will not retain certain executive positions." "You mean me?" he said flatly. "Yes." The word landed like a hammer strike. His chair scraped back hard against the floor as he stood. "So you're not just selling the company, you're making sure I have no place in it. Is that it?" I met his gaze. "You told me to stay out of your life, Ethan. This is me doing exactly that." For a moment he just stared at me, jaw tight, eyes burning with something between rage and disbelief. Then he gave a short, humorless laugh. "You always said you were doing everything for me. Turns out you were just doing it to me." He walked out, the door slamming behind him hard enough to make the coffee cups rattle. The room was silent except for the faint buzz of the overhead lights. No one seemed to know where to look. I glanced around at the faces, some shocked, some resigned, some clearly calculating what this change meant for their own careers. Rachel was the only one who held my gaze. She didn't smile, didn't frown, just gave the smallest nod as if to say, "You've done it. Now live with it." I closed my folder, feeling the weight of the moment press against my chest. The decision was final. The die was cast. And somewhere down the hall, my son was walking away from me in a way that felt a lot more permanent than the last time. The sound of the door slamming was still echoing in my head when the meeting broke apart. People gathered their papers in silence, speaking in hushed tones as they filed out. I could tell they were trying to avoid eye contact, not out of disrespect, but because they weren't sure whose side they should be on. Rachel lingered at the far end of the table, stacking the untouched packets of the agenda. "Do you want me to check on him?" she asked quietly. I shook my head. If he wanted to hear from me, he wouldn't have walked out. She hesitated before replying. "Jack, You've won a lot of battles in your life, but this one, I'm not sure you'll want the victory." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Back in my office, the city skyline stretched out before me, the afternoon sun bouncing off glass towers. It should have been a good day, a day where a major deal was set in motion, where years of work were about to pay off. But the air felt heavy, like the room was holding its breath. I loosened my tie and sat behind the desk, staring at the pen I'd used to sign the preliminary sale documents. My hand rested on it for a long time, remembering the way Maggie used to joke that I could sign my way into anything but an early retirement. This time, though, it wasn't just a signature. It was a severance, one that reached deeper than contracts or company titles. An hour later, I stepped into the hallway. The place was quieter than usual. I didn't have to look far to find out why. Ethan's office door was open again, but it wasn't empty this time. He was inside, standing over his desk, sliding a handful of personal items into a cardboard box, a framed photo of him and his mother, a couple of books, a crystal paperweight Maggie had given him on his first day. I stood in the doorway. "Ethan, don't," he said without looking up. "Not now." He turned then, his eyes sharp. "You just made it crystal clear, Dad. This company was never about me. It was about you. And when I didn't fit the part you'd written for me, you'd rather hand it to Victor Hale than see me try on my own terms." "That's not what this is," I said quietly. "Then what is it?" he shot back. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like you sold more than a company today." He brushed past me, the box tucked under his arm. I caught a whiff of his cologne, faint, familiar, and for a split second, I was hit with a memory of helping him get ready for his first job interview, straightening his tie in the mirror while Maggie fussed over his hair. Now he didn't even glance back. I stood in the doorway long after he disappeared down the hall, the sound of his footsteps fading into the elevator's distant chime. That evening, I didn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly through the city, past the river, past the stadium, past the neighborhoods where Maggie and I had once dreamed of buying a bigger house. It was only when I found myself in front of the old lake house that I pulled over. The sun was dipping low, staining the water in streaks of orange and gold. I sat there for a while, the engine ticking as it cooled, listening to the soft lap of water against the shore. I told myself I was doing this for both of us, that letting go of Turner & Co. would give Ethan the freedom he wanted and me the peace I needed. But sitting there, watching the light fade, I couldn't help wondering if I'd just traded one kind of distance for another. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find Rachel waiting at my door. She had a single sheet of paper in her hand. "He dropped this off," she said. It was a resignation letter, not just from his position, from the company entirely, effective immediately. Her voice was gentle. "Jack, there's still time to stop the sale if you want to." I set the letter on my desk, smoothing it with my palm. "No, there isn't." Because the truth was, the sale was no longer just about business. It was about keeping my word, even the one I'd never spoken out loud. If my son wanted me out of his life, I'd give him nothing to cling to, not even the company. Ethan didn't come back to the office the day after he resigned, or the day after that, but on the third morning, Rachel appeared at my door again. This time, she looked thoughtful. "I went into his office to start clearing things out," she said. "There's something you should see." I followed her down the hall. Ethan's office still smelled faintly of his cologne, but now it was stripped bare, just a desk, an empty bookshelf, and the sunlight falling across the carpet. Rachel pointed to the corner of the desk, where a manila envelope lay untouched. My name wasn't on it. Instead, it read in Maggie's looping handwriting, "For Ethan when you're ready." The sight of it made my chest tighten. Rachel spoke quietly. "I think he must have found it after he cleared out. Maybe he didn't have the heart to take it with him. Or maybe," she hesitated, "maybe he thought you should be the one to give it to him." I picked up the envelope. It was light, the paper inside slightly curled with age. I knew exactly where it had come from, Maggie's desk at home. She'd kept a little box of things she wanted Ethan to have someday, though she'd never been specific about when someday would be. Back in my office, I sat down and turned the envelope over in my hands. Part of me wanted to open it, to see what she'd written, to know if her words might bridge the gap I hadn't been able to close, but it wasn't mine to read. That evening, I drove to Ethan's apartment. It was in a newer building, the kind with glass balconies and a concierge who looked barely old enough to rent a car. When he opened the door, his expression was guarded. "What do you want?" he asked. I held up the envelope. "This was on your desk. It's from your mother." For a second, something flickered in his eyes, surprise, maybe even a trace of softness, but it vanished quickly. "I'll take it," he said, reaching for it. I didn't let go right away. "She must have written it a long time ago. I don't know what's in it, but if she thought you should have it, maybe it's worth reading before you decide what you think about me." He exhaled, a slow, tired sound. "Good night, Dad." I released the envelope and stepped back. I don't know if he opened it right away or if it sat on his kitchen counter for hours, the way things do when you're not sure you're ready for them. But I know what Maggie's letters were like. She didn't waste words. She would have told him what she'd told me in that hospital room all those years ago, that love and control aren't the same thing, and that sometimes letting go is the only way to keep a relationship alive. I went home that night with no idea whether her words would change anything, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I'd placed something in Ethan's hands that might actually reach him, something that wasn't about me or the company or the history between us. It was just from her, and if anyone could cut through the noise we'd made, it was Maggie. Ethan didn't open the letter right away. He set it on the kitchen counter when he came back inside, still sealed in its faded manila envelope. It sat there through the evening while he made a half-hearted attempt at dinner, flipping through channels on the TV without really watching. Every time his eyes drifted toward it, he felt the pull and the resistance. The handwriting on the front was so familiar it hurt. His mother's script had a slight rightward slant, each letter looping gracefully into the next. She'd written him notes for years in lunchboxes, tucked inside textbooks, left on his nightstand before early morning trips. But this one was different. This one had been written for a version of him she'd never meet. It was close to midnight when he finally picked it up and sat at the small dining table. The city outside his window was still alive, headlights threading the streets, but in his apartment it was just him, the sound of the envelope tearing open and the rustle of paper. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means enough time has passed for you to be ready or maybe just curious about what I wanted to say. I don't know how old you are now. I hope you've grown into a man who knows what makes him happy. Not the kind of happy other people tell you should want, the kind you feel in your bones. Your father loves you more than you will ever be able to measure, but he also loves building things. Sometimes, I think he forgets that people aren't projects. If he's pushing you, it's because he believes the world will try to take more from you than it gives. That belief has made him a great provider, and sometimes a difficult man to love. You don't have to live your life the way he planned it, but don't mistake his plans for selfishness. Everything he's done, even the parts that made you feel trapped, has been his way of protecting you. One day, you'll understand that love can be clumsy, even when it's deep. Whatever happens between you and him, Ethan, don't let pride be the reason you stay silent. Pride will keep you safe, but it will also keep you lonely. Mom. Ethan read it twice, then a third time slower. By the end, his vision blurred in a way he couldn't quite blink away. He folded the letter carefully, set it back on the table, and sat there with his hands pressed to his face. She had seen it coming, not the sale, not the arguments, but the gap. The inevitable space between a father who lived by building and a son who needed to make his own map. And she had been right about pride. Across the city, I was sitting in my own kitchen, staring at my phone on the counter. I wasn't expecting a call. Ethan hadn't reached out in weeks, but a part of me kept glancing at it anyway. I poured myself another bourbon, told myself it was for the taste, not the waiting. When the phone finally lit up with his name, I didn't move at first. Just stared at it, the seconds ticking by. Then I picked it up. "Dad," he said. His voice was steady, but softer than I'd heard it in a long time. "I read Mom's letter." I closed my eyes, and there was a pause, the faint sound of traffic on his end. I still don't agree with what you did, but I get why you did it. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a door, and for now that was enough. We met at the lake house. It wasn't planned that way, not exactly. I'd suggested we talk somewhere quiet, away from the office, away from the city. Ethan had surprised me by naming the lake house himself, as if he knew I'd be less guarded there. The afternoon was cool, the sky a pale winter blue. The wooden boards of the porch creaked under our weight as we stepped inside. Dust motes floated lazily in the sunlight slanting through the windows. It smelled faintly of pine and old coffee grounds, the way it always did when it had been closed up for a while. I set my keys on the counter and gestured toward the armchairs by the fireplace. "Sit, I'll make some coffee." He stayed standing while I busied myself in the kitchen, the sound of the kettle filling breaking the silence. When I came back with 2 mugs, he finally took a seat. "I don't want to go in circles," he said, hands wrapped around the mug. "So let's just start with this. Why Victor?" I sat opposite him, leaning forward, because he was the only one who would take it on my terms. "Your terms," he repeated flatly. "Yes," I said. "Terms that kept the company intact, the employees secure, and you out of it." His jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "I know how that sounds, but hear me out. You told me you wanted me out of your life. I took you at your word. Selling to Victor was the cleanest way to make sure you could go build something without the shadow of Turner & Co. hanging over you, without people assuming you only had it because your father handed it to you." He shook his head. "You could have just stepped back and let me run it." "I could have." I agreed. "And you would have spent the next 10 years proving you weren't me, in a building where every wall had my fingerprints on it. You'd be fighting ghosts instead of building your own legacy." For a moment, the only sound was the faint tick of the old wall clock. Ethan stared into his coffee, his expression unreadable. "You think you know what's best for me," he said finally. "You always have." "I do think I know some things," I admitted. "Like the fact that this company has defined me for so long. It would have tried to define you too, whether you wanted it or not. I wasn't willing to make you carry that weight just so I could feel like I was passing something down." He looked up then, his eyes sharper but less angry than I expected. "So you decided to burn the bridge." I didn't flinch. "Better than making you live on it." We sat with that for a while. The fire popped softly in the grate. Outside, the lake was still, the water catching the last of the light. Ethan spoke again, quieter this time. "Mom said in her letter that your love can be clumsy." A corner of my mouth lifted. She always had a way of putting things gently. "She also said I shouldn't let pride keep me from talking to you," he went on. "I guess that goes both ways." I nodded. "Yeah, it does." He didn't say he forgave me. I didn't ask him to, but as we sat there, sipping coffee in the fading light, I felt the distance between us shift, not closing entirely but changing shape. Less like a wall, more like a stretch of open water we might, one day, decide to cross. A year can change more than you expect and less than you hope. The seasons had turned over twice since that day at the lake house. I'd signed the final papers, handed the keys, figurative and literal, to Victor Hale and walked out of Turner & Co. For the last time, I'd expected the silence that followed to feel like a void. It didn't. It felt like a slow exhale I hadn't realized I'd been holding for decades. I spent that year differently. I traveled some, not far, but far enough to see places I'd only read about. I started fishing again. I even took a woodworking class at the community center, though the birdhouse I made still leaned slightly to the left. And I didn't see Ethan, not once. We exchanged the occasional text, "Happy birthday, Merry Christmas, how are you?" but nothing more. It was an uneasy truce, each of us keeping to our own shore. It was early autumn when I got the message. "Can we meet at the lake house this weekend?" No explanation, no preamble. I drove up on Saturday morning, the air crisp, leaves already turning along the winding road. The lake house looked the same as it always had, weathered but solid, its reflection rippling faintly in the water. Ethan's car was parked out front. I found him down by the pier, hands in his jacket pockets, looking out across the lake. The boards under my boots creaked as I walked toward him, but he didn't turn until I was beside him. Hey, Dad. Hey, son. For a while, we just stood there, the lake stretching quiet and endless in front of us. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke from some distant cabin. He was the one who broke the silence. I started something. I glanced at him. A business. He nodded. Small consulting firm, just me and 2 others for now. We've landed 3 clients. It's mine, all mine. There was a pride in his voice, not boastful but steady, the kind that comes from building something with your own hands. I'm glad, I said, and I meant it. He shifted, his eyes on the water. I was angry at you for a long time, selling the company to Victor. I thought it was about winning some old rivalry or punishing me. But I get it now. You were giving me exactly what I said I wanted, even if I didn't know how to take it then. I let the words settle before I answered. I didn't know if you'd ever see it that way. I just hoped someday you might. We both smiled, faint but real. The sun was starting to dip, painting the lake in shades of gold. Ethan glanced toward the house. Coffee. Sure, I said. We walked back up the path side by side. It wasn't a reconciliation wrapped in grand speeches or teary embraces. It was something quieter, sturdier, a meeting in the middle after a long year on separate shores. And as we reached the porch, I realized Maggie had been right about one thing all along. Sometimes letting go isn't the end. Sometimes it's the only way to find your way back. The next morning at the lake house, the air was still and cool. A thin mist hovered over the water, the kind that makes the world feel suspended between night and day. I woke early and made coffee, the old percolator sputtering like it always had. Ethan joined me on the porch, barefoot, his hair still damp from a shower. He carried 2 mugs and handed one to me without a word. We sat there in the rocking chairs, the boards creaking under our slow rhythm, watching the mist lift off the lake. It struck me then how rare these moments were, not just with him, but in life. The quiet times where nothing needs fixing, nothing needs proving, and you can simply share the same air without filling it with noise. I used to think inheritance meant handing you something tangible, I said after a while. Land, a business, a portfolio, something people could see. Ethan glanced at me over his mug. And now I think it's the things people can't see. The way you show up for people, the way you stand by your word, the way you take responsibility for the things you build and for the people you build them with. I smiled faintly. Those things outlast companies. He was quiet for a moment, then nodded. I guess that means I've already inherited something from you, whether I wanted to or not. Maybe, I said. And maybe I've inherited something from you too. The reminder that letting go doesn't mean walking away. It just means making room for someone to grow. The sun rose higher, scattering gold across the lake's surface. Somewhere behind us, a loon called from deep in the trees. We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. I realized we'd finally reached the place I'd been aiming for all along, not the transfer of a company, but the passing of understanding. The business was gone. The tension was softer now, and what we had left felt enough. When Ethan eventually packed up to leave, we stood at the edge of the porch. He gripped my shoulder once firmly and said, "See you soon, Dad." It was only 3 words, but they felt heavier and lighter than any contract I'd ever signed. I watched his car disappear down the winding road, the morning light catching the windshield until it was just a glint, then nothing at all. The lake was still again. My coffee had gone cold, but I didn't mind. I'd kept my promise to Maggie. I'd let him go, and in doing so, I'd found a way to keep him. Thank you for spending your time with Family Shadows today, and for walking through this journey with us. Stories like this remind us that family isn't about what we leave behind in our hands, but what we carry forward in our hearts. I wish you and your loved ones peace, health, and the kind of happiness that lasts through every season. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. We'll meet again in the next story.